You're listening to the Heart and Soul podcast with Kathryn Banco. I'm on a mission to celebrate breakthrough, empowerment, and shameless living in the lives of women everywhere. Join me and let's live unashamed together. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Heart and Soul. Today I am joined by, I hope I say your last name right, Tabitha Panariso.
Good job. Yes.
I nailed it. Okay. Who is a trauma-informed and licensed professional therapist and now author who guides readers through the life and death of Jesus as a path through the pain of rejection, which we're all very acquainted with, which compassionately offering strength and healing through her new book, which is called Loyal in His Love, an invitation to be held by Jesus when others let go. So Tabitha, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kathryn. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. I would love for you to just kind of start by telling my listeners a little bit more about who you are and what you do, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So just starting with a little bit of what you mentioned, I'm a trauma-informed LPCC here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I own my own private practice and have been doing that for several years. I've been married to my husband, Ethan, for about 17. I have 3 kiddos who are 10, 8, and 6. So we're just like really in the thick of it as far as like elementary school aged, just doing that life, school pickups and whatnot. And then, we love the mountains. We love drinking coffee. We love being together. And we are desperately waiting for winter to end, or at least I am. So it's about this time when I just lose all capacity and resilience. And I'm like, I just need the sun to come out, please.
I mean, we live in North Carolina where we will randomly get like a 65 degree,
Yes.
70 degree day in the winter, and it's like everything. And then
Yes.
it's like very bipolar. It just goes back to being cold and it can't decide. And I can't
Mhm.
imagine being somewhere that's that cold for all winter. I would go
Yeah.
crazy.
That's exactly what happened to us this weekend. We had 60-degree weather, which for Coloradoans is, a summer day. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not depressed. I just needed the sun. And then, of course, it decided to snow today. So such is the life of living.
Good times. Okay, so you're a therapist.
Mhm.
Wow. What made you decide that was the career path you wanted to take?
Oh gosh. It's actually funny because I was a school counselor prior to being in private practice. So my original career before having kids was working with kids. I created a program here at a charter school here in town and worked with kindergarten through 8th grade, and really started that career very young. I was probably, I don't know, 25, 26 years old. And really what led me to counseling initially was that I just had kind of a tumultuous childhood, just as far as my mom was in the military. She was gone often. We moved a lot. I struggled with friendships. And so I can very clearly remember a time when my mom was actually deployed overseas. She was a single mom. And she was in Turkey, and I couldn't go with her. And I just remember spending so much time in the nurse's office because there just wasn't any school counselors. And I was just trying to find solace and care wherever I could receive it. I was living with my grandmother at the time. And so that's really initially what drove me into counseling. And then, as I grew and, became a woman and experienced life through different lens, I really realized I want to help other women and men who are just in this season of life of trying to find healing. Because I had also gone through a season where I needed therapy and I wanted help. And so that kind of reignited my passion for it after having taken a break for, 8 years with my kids. And so it's been a joy to be back in it, and to just be helping other people just navigate their lives. And really that trauma piece, what I'm really passionate about is discovering how their past informs their present and how we can shape it so that it doesn't necessarily define their future too.
So when your mother was deployed and you were living with your grandmother,
Mhm.
was there a time in your life when, as a child, when you did therapy, or was it just something you wished you could have?
Mm. Yeah, I don't think I did do any. I think there may have been one snippet in my life where I went to go see a therapist. I vaguely remember it. I remember hating it. I think it lasted only for like a week or two. I think that was before therapy had really the field didn't quite really understand how to sit with kids, in
Yeah.
that emotional space. And so it's not a surprise that I hated it. Um, yeah, I don't know that I wished for it. I think what I hoped for was just the presence of somebody in my life who could see that I was struggling and that could be with me. They say that in order to prevent trauma from happening, one of the major markers of that is having people surround you, having community support. And so I just felt a lack of community support. And I think that's what I really desired most. And I think that's what would have helped the most as a kid.
Right. I mean, like that's biblical,
Mhm.
that we need each other, we need community.
Yeah.
So when you feel isolated, I'm sure it like takes a bit out of your identity as a whole of like, who am I? What's my place?
Mhm.
Why am I here? What's my purpose?
Yeah.
Um, what would you say is the definition of trauma?
Yeah. Ugh. I feel like so many people have different opinions about this.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I think that I do abide by the belief that there is what we call big T trauma and little T trauma, right? That there can be massively significant events that happen to us, and also what we might say are smaller events that other people might look at and say, like, I'm not sure, I don't understand how that's impactful. But it's essentially something that occurs and then continues to live on inside of your body that hasn't healed and is most likely unresolved, right? And that has had lasting effects on our capacity to cope and regulate ourselves.
Good definition. Would you say that like, I'm sure there's maybe like different ways of viewing this as both a therapist and a believer, but would
Mhm.
you say that you can like totally heal from trauma, or that it's something that's kind of always in you that you just always need to combat and have the right tools to figure out how to, I guess when it rears its ugly head, how to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, as a believer, as a Christian, it would feel pretty unbiblical for me to stand here and say I don't think that you could heal from it. I do.
Right.
I do believe that you can find redemption in your story and you can move forward from whatever trauma has occurred to you. I think that is possible. I think that we can be freed and healed from the wounds of our past. I think that's very possible. I think that as therapists, we are constantly navigating the world of how to do that and what does that look like, because there's kind of two tiers of therapy. There's the tier of let's learn how to cope or regulate ourselves because we're being maybe triggered or activated by trauma, and then there's the tier of let's go deeper and let's help you tell a new story about the trauma that has happened to you. But we see in science, like with neuroplasticity, it is possible to rewire and repattern our brains. And so, because of that, because we know that that's possible, then we can believe that it's possible to see that happen with trauma in our lives too.
Yeah, I just the reason I asked that is because I am also a believer, and um I feel like I had a really blessed and really privileged
Mhm.
childhood, and I'm so thankful for that. But as an adult, I have gone through an eating disorder, and then I've also in the last 4 4 or 5 years gone through a lot of fertility loss. And I it's like one of those things where, especially with my eating disorder, because it's a little bit further back, where I'm like, okay, I think I'm healed, and then like, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy, so he'll like kind of throw at me a little lie that I start to believe, because he knows that's my weak area, my weak spot is like body image. um and then I find that I have to like okay, I really have to keep like using the tools and the truth that I've learned and I use to heal. I kind of have to keep using that. And same
Mhm.
thing with like pregnancy. Like every time I've had a pregnancy, the first thing I hear now is the lies of it's not going to make it, instead of like trusting God in the process. So I just feel like it's always so good to work with someone like you who um, is both spiritually informed and scientifically informed to give you like truth and biblical truth, but also tools to navigate, because we're only human, we're flesh, and the enemy's gonna come and get us. So I think it's, I've always said that healing is kind of like an ongoing thing. I realize God's bigger than me and he can heal someone like that day and boom, it's gone. But for me, it's always been something that kind of pops back up.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. I think what you're kind of alluding to is really like the spiritual self and then the physical self, right? And I think that we really can feel healed and free and whole within our spiritual self. But that human part of us, the physical part, that's the part that suffers with desire and longings and addictions, right? And so I think that's the part that we learn how to um like cope with, to regulate, to try to, as much as we can, bend it to the spiritual self whenever we have the opportunity. And that really is a process and takes time, and sometimes we have to revisit things that we've learned years ago. Yeah.
It's kind of frustrating sometimes when you're like, oh, I thought I was like over this, and then you're
Yeah.
not. Um, so let would you mind sharing a little bit about did you grow up with this kind of faith, or did you find your faith later on in life? Like how did that play into you
Yeah.
and your career and just in trauma in general?
Yeah, I would always, my mom was actually a chaplain's assistant growing up. So she helped, the military has, a whole sect of churches planted within military bases. And usually those churches are a combination of Catholic and Presbyterian. And so, I really did grow up in the church while she worked alongside people putting these services on together. But she was also a believer. And so I was always there and present. I wouldn't say that even though I knew of God and I was participating in youth group and having experiences with God, I wouldn't say I hadn't really like devoted my life to him until I turned to 18. There was just like this moment when I was about to graduate where I just felt this conviction of needing to make a choice, like knowing that I was about to like go out into the world and that I could choose either to succumb to what I thought was just like a lot of worldly pressure or make this choice to stick with God and stay with God. And so that really was the moment I felt like I surrendered my life to him and said, Lord, you are my savior, and I want to follow you. Like not just you're saving me, but I'm inviting you into my life to tell me how to live my life, right? And so I would say 18, and then, he's been a part of my life ever since. And so I think obviously like our faith grows and changes, and it's kind of wild looking back at even just the landscape of my own faith. Certainly there have been ups and downs, but I've just learned as I've become a therapist, as I've worked with clients, especially clients who are believers, like it's really a disservice to ourselves when we separate our ideas of God and who God is from like our pain or our sufferings and our mental health. I just really believe in that holistic perspective of we are mind, body, soul. And as a therapist, I want to be able to enter into all those spaces with you because I do want you to walk away from therapy feeling whole, right? And so I've also noticed in my own life, like I remember I had a miscarriage before my three kids, and I remember that not only was I grieving the loss of this dream and of our child, but I also was really angry with God and like really trying to understand like why me? Why did this happen? And I think those beliefs or what the like the narrative that we're having about God or with God really does play into how we process things that can feel traumatic or hard or difficult. And so yeah, I think when we as believers can acknowledge all of those things come together, it's so much better for us as humans.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. I've had four miscarriages, and each time I've been incredibly angry with
Mhm.
God. But it was in that like wrestling where I felt like he actually met me most. And I
Mhm.
think it is important to like not shy away from um entering into that like spiritual realm with God because you feel like you're not like well or not like patched up enough or you're angry or you have some sort of emotion towards him because I mean that's just relationship in general. And then, you know, with that, like my husband and I see a therapist who he's a believer and he understands how the body works, like how we store trauma. And, you know, it's so nice to have mind, body, soul all connect in one room, um, where you can really share like I'm angry but also I love him and that makes sense to someone. Do you know what I mean? It's like I still love God but like I really don't like him right now, you know, that like as if, you know, without that sounding like crazy, it's so
Yeah.
nice to intermingle the two and
Mhm.
to make it make sense. So I love that you said that. It seems that after previewing your book,
Mhm.
one of the biggest themes is rejection.
Yeah.
um would you mind kind of diving into why you chose the theme of rejection for your book and how that's kind of like spelled out throughout the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I didn't want to write this book on rejection initially. Like, it wasn't a topic that I necessarily chose. It sort of chose me. Um, it's funny, not funny, haha, but just ironic that when we go through like really difficult seasons, we are looking for wisdom on those things. And I went through some friendship breakups that with friends who were particularly meaningful to me that I had done a lot of life with, and I was just really struggling from healing from it. I could not move on, and there was this moment where I just recognized and could acknowledge, oh, this is festering open all of these wounds that you've experienced through the lifetime of your story. And it's not just about these friendship breakups. It's really about, hey, you were betrayed and rejected by your church. Your or my dad, he walked out on me when I was 5. He abandoned me. Like that these really significant events alongside so many other little ones really had formed me in a lot of ways and had created me to be the person I am now for both good and also not great. And so it was this revelationary moment of realizing, oh, rejection really does impact us, which I knew, but I didn't think I knew the depth of. And I think part of that is because we just don't talk about it. It's not something I feel like I see people conversing about is how they were rejected from a job or whatever. Really what I saw was just a lot of platitudes where it was like, well, everything happens for a reason, or if what's the other one, if God closes one door, he'll open
Open
a
a
window.
window.
Exactly. And as somebody who experienced her father not wanting to be in her life, that just felt pretty shallow. Like that really wasn't meeting me maybe where those authors thought they should, whoever, those
It's
original thought.
annoying.
It
It's
is.
annoying. It's like, shut up. I don't want to hear that. I mean, people used to say everything happens for a reason to me when I would lose a baby. And I'm like, can you just say this sucks? Like,
Yes.
I'm not seeing the reason and I don't feel like I need to see it right now. And
Yes. Yeah. And that was the thing is I just wanted permission for rejection to be hard. I
Yeah.
wanted permission to say, hey, like this really does suck. And yeah, like let's find a way through it. But also, I'm going to sit here for a minute and I'm going to like be okay with it sucking. And so that really was the dream behind the book, and my prayer for it was just that it would meet someone like me, that needed something more meaningful for the rejection, the abandonment, the betrayal that they've experienced in their life.
Used to like those little isms, those little
Mhm.
sayings used to trigger me so much. And like I mean, to the point where I was like, I cannot talk to you anymore. But you know what it did is it kind of prepared me to meet people who were suffering, because you don't know what something's like until you've really been through it. Like you really don't have complete empathy, in my opinion, until you've actually experienced it. So like, I've had friends who lost babies before I had ever lost a baby, and was very much like, I probably use those platitudes of like, and I don't really remember. I can't pick out a certain moment, but it's like, I'm sure I said something so stupid like that. And now I'm on the other side of it. And it's like, God has prepared me to like be more empathetic and meet people where they're at. And like, what do you need right now? What would help you best? Do you want me to drop off a meal, or do you want me to just sit with you and say this sucks? Do you want me to go through a bottle of wine with you and like, let's cry together, or what? And, yeah, I just love that you said that, because I'm very passionate about the everything happens for a reason.
I we're right there.
I
I
can't.
just can't. I just can't.
I
And
just
even when I was
can't.
writing the book, I was like, please don't let any of these words come off as a platitude.
Yes, it's
We're here,
crazy.
unlocked.
Something also similar between us is I experienced rejection as an adult with
Hmm.
one of my best friends,
Mhm.
and we're no longer in each other's lives anymore. And it was crazy how that moment, even as like I was 29 when it happened, so I felt like I was grown up enough to like handle a situation like that. But it was interesting how that moment brought up a lot of things from my past that I didn't even realize were still inside of me, or I didn't even realize were a problem until one particular moment of rejection like festered them and made them come up to the surface. So I think it's really important to talk about this idea of rejection, especially in parallel to Christ, because he's like the most rejected man ever when he was on earth, and still um went through it for
Yeah.
our sake.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit more about your book, and just like what a reader can expect? Also, is this your first book?
It is my first book. Yes.
Congrats.
Thank you. What a way to start, right? Just
Yeah.
bearing my heart.
Yeah. Dive on all in.
Yeah. So the book is divided into two parts. The first five chapters are from death, and then the last five chapters are to life. And so we really spend a lot of time in the first five chapters kind of sitting in like the pain of rejection and the questions that you might have, the ways that rejection forms you, right? Like it's really this piece of acknowledging how rejection has played a role in your life and what it might have meant for you. For me, it meant, wearing a mask, a lot of perfection, a lot of self sabotage. Like there were ways that I was shrinking myself in my own life and in my own story in order to prevent rejection from happening to me. And we also talk a little bit about just how sometimes we're complicit in rejection, not in that this condemning way of like, I'm the problem or you're the problem, but just how we can have a proclivity to like put people on a platform or idolize them and not even realize we're doing that, and how ultimately that feeds into the just the way that rejection feels when we are being rejected, right? Like, oh, this person meant so much more than what they maybe should have. And that's why this wound is so deep and so hard to recover from. And then the last 5 chapters really are about entering into, okay, well, what does it look like now to heal? What does it look like to begin to refine yourself, to refine God, to give yourself compassion and grace, which really is like probably one of my favorite parts of the book is just talking about self-compassion and how compassion really is embodying what Christ already did for us. And and how when Christ holds us, when he's there with us, then that changes the way that we can show up in the world. And so it's that exploration of like, if Christ is with you, if he is holding you through all this pain and suffering, what does that enable you to do? Like, what does it motivate you to do? And so I, it's funny, I was talking to some friends yesterday, and one of them was saying how she was just really glad that I didn't end the book on kind of like a positive note, which sounds terrible. But even though there's all this hope, one of the things I was really careful about was just acknowledging like, just because we heal internally doesn't mean we might find restoration with those friends that hurt us or the people who hurt us. And I certainly didn't. You know, the stories I talk about, there hasn't been reconciliation there with those groups or with those people. And so I acknowledge that. I acknowledge the very real reality of like a lot of this work that we're doing when it comes to rejection is really internal. It's really about our heart and how we're positioning it and posturing ourselves in the world. If that's with generosity and like leaning into people as much as we can, or if it's with self-protection and kind of leaning out because of fear. And so just really encouraging the reader to lean in for themselves and for other people. And then one of my favorite features of the book is that there's breath prayers in between, kind of like what we were talking about before, like the idea of just embodying like what we're learning and what we're believing. Before each chapter, there's a prayer and a breath prayer that kind of goes alongside it so that you can kind of just breathe in and out the lessons that I hope that maybe you're gaining while reading.
I think that sounds really, really cool. Very, very both realistic and encouraging, as well as like a place to move forward. Our church recently did like this sermon on forgiveness, and um, what you were just saying kind of made me think of it is, um, I feel like you can forgive, like my friend who rejected me, for instance, like we're not friends anymore. And I would love to repair that friendship. However, it's a two-way street. And so it when we were leaving church, my husband asked me like, "Oh, have you forgiven her?" And I'm like, "I really have." And I can both forgive her and also keep my distance at the same time. Um um and I don't know why I brought that up, but it just one thing you said about that really sparked that in me. But then the computer cut out and I kind of lost my train of thought. So
I know, I love that. It's so funny. I actually really avoided using the word forgiveness in the book only because I think people have a lot of resistance towards that word, especially even if you are a believer. I think sometimes it can feel really, I don't know, like it's thrown at you, like kind of like an ism, like, oh, you just have to forgive and you just have to forget, right? And I do believe that forgiveness is part of our walk as believers. But what I try to lean into instead is like this word generosity, because to me, generosity is like embodying forgiveness. So it's actually trying to take steps towards living that forgiveness out in your life. And that looks very different depending on context, depending on who we're talking about, but it could look like just simply praying for that person, right? Like if they mattered to you and you think about them often, maybe generosity or walking out forgiveness looks like saying a prayer for them. You know, maybe you write them a letter, you know, if that makes sense for your context. Maybe that's generosity. Maybe it's being willing to say hi to them as you're passing them in the hallway at the work, you know, that you both share. Just being able to do something different with that heart posture that really requires us to be dependent on the Lord, which is stretching. It's very stretching. I will be the first to admit that.
think it's I think the heart posture is the right way of putting it, because I think sometimes part of forgiveness is also for you to just release bitterness. So like maybe you're like, okay, this person probably isn't safe to have in my life anymore. So like forgiveness doesn't mean I just like jump back into a friendship with them, but
Right.
at least I can release this bitterness
Hmm.
of them having this power over my heart.
Yeah.
And more so that compassion element for yourself of like, okay, I'm being compassionate towards myself by removing this bitterness.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, but that's why we all need to read your book.
Oh, but like I said, caveat is I know it's hard. I know
Yeah.
it's, and I even to this day feel like I'm still working out the things that I have written about because that is part of being human, right? Like we're in a process of becoming all the time.
Bring this up with people in my life. I'm like, you're really not going to see it or even see complete, like, have a complete understanding of anything until you're on the other side. Like, until
Yeah.
you're in heaven, you're like, oh, okay. But, like, the whole point is maybe you don't need to see the purpose
Mhm.
in it. Maybe it's just the journey, or so cheesy, but like maybe it's the process that
Mhm.
is the point, you know?
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. That is something I write about when we were talking about the isms. If God closes a door and he opens a window, the real question is like, who are we when we crawl through it? So when we are crawling through rejection, when we are navigating hardship, the real question isn't how that all ends for us or what is on the other side of that pain and suffering. I think the real question is how has our character been formed by it? How have we allowed ourselves to be formed by it? What does that look like for us? And I think that's really what God cares about is that piece of, our heart and how we're changed by the things that we go through.
I feel like I could talk to you forever, but my daughter is about to wake up from her nap. It, or she might already be awake. I hear something, but it could be my dog. I don't know. Um, Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Would you mind telling my listeners what's the best way for them to connect with you and to also find your book? And I'll obviously put everything in the show notes. But
No, thank you so much for having me on. This was so great. Yeah, they can find me on Instagram at Tabitha Panariso. I also have a Substack, which essentially is like a blog called Unseen Things. And that's where I put most of my long form essays. And then as far as the book goes, they can buy it from Amazon. They can request it at their library or local bookstores. And I think they can also find it on Barnes and Noble and Target's website as well. So it's pretty much everywhere at this point in time, I believe.
like a real author. That's
I
so
know.
cool.
Kind of crazy. Kind of crazy.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And listeners, I will put all those links in the show notes so that you can easily add her book to your cart and also follow her on Instagram and Substack. So, Tabitha, again, thank you so much for being a guest today. It was so awesome talking with you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking such great questions.
Oh, well, listeners, I will be back next week. I believe next week it is just yours truly, so you don't have a guest to look forward to. But I can talk forever. So I'll talk to you next week. Bye. Thanks for listening to Heart and Soul. If this episode encouraged you in any way, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Talk to you next week.